The other cluster feature in vSphere, which gets used a lot less than any of the other vSphere cluster features, is a feature called vSphere fault tolerance. I mentioned this briefly when we were looking at vSphere HA, vSphere high availability. Whereas vSphere high availability, the VM, in the event of a host failure, the VM is lost and HA will go and find it and restart it on another host. vSphere fault tolerance goes one step further to ensure that there is absolutely no interruption of service when that host fails. That sounds great. As you'll see in a moment, though, there's a few challenges. And what I would say to you is use vSphere fault tolerance as a last resort. If you have a virtual machine that is absolutely mission critical, first of all, talk to the vendor of the application, see if there is a way to create high availability within the application. That might be some clustering feature within the application, allows you to create two application servers and the application will connect to whichever is available or something like that. If that's not an option, consider vSphere high availability. Only as a last resort, if that application cannot be scaled out by deploying to multiple separate VMs, or if you cannot tolerate even a few minutes downtime on that, then you can look at vSphere fault tolerance. Certainly don't use this in anger. What vSphere fault tolerance does is it essentially has the VM running twice on two separate hosts. So if that's quite a large VM, which it very possibly would be, this is a virtual machine that is so critical we cannot manage without a few minutes downtime, it probably is fairly resource intensive VM as well. So it's using all of those resources simultaneously on two hosts. And every instruction, every CPU instruction, memory operation, disk operation that happens on one has to happen on the other at exactly the same moment in perfect lockstep. You can imagine there is a bit of overhead in keeping those virtual machines, those two separate virtual machines, completely in lockstep. And to do so, you have to have 10 gigabit Ethernet connectivity between the two hosts that are involved in this process. If you haven't got that, then the synchronization that goes on between the two virtual machines to keep them in lockstep would be too slow and it would be unusable. We'll now configure vSphere fault tolerance on one of our virtual machines here as a demonstration. The first thing we need to do is configure a network adapter that we are going to use for the fault tolerance logging. So this is on our VM kernel adapter. I'm going to take a look at this one here. We can see fault tolerance logging. So that is transporting logs between the two hosts to allow these virtual machines to remain in lockstep. I strongly recommend you have at least two network adapters which are both 10 gigabit Ethernet adapters and are dedicated to this function. You don't want other traffic on these network adapters to introduce contention for your fault tolerance logging, because if that fault tolerance logging becomes unreliable, the virtual machine is not going to be usable. We're going to set it on my management VM kernel just for this demonstration. However, in production, this is an absolute no-no. So now we've enabled fault tolerance logging on both of those VM kernel NICs in our hosts. We can now go ahead and enable fault tolerance for one of our virtual machines. So to do that, we right click on a virtual machine and we say turn on fault tolerance. So this is now going to create a separate virtual machine. It's essentially a clone of the first virtual machine. So we need to select a data store on which we are going to store that. We now need to select a host for the other VM. So you'll note host 1 is the only one listed because host 2 is the one that is running this virtual machine. Fairly obviously, there'll be no point in putting both VMs onto one host. We'll take a look there. We can see start fault tolerance secondary VM. We can see our virtual machine there. There's currently a warning sign on that because its other virtual machine is not yet ready. We can see our host is moving VMs around to make space for the standby virtual machine in this fault tolerant set. We'll just give that a few minutes to create that secondary VM and take a look at what it looks like once vSphere fault tolerance is enabled. So now we have our VM enabled for vSphere fault tolerance. We scroll down on the VM, we can see the icon has changed to signify fault tolerance and it shows primary listed there. If we scroll down, we can see this section here on fault tolerance. At the moment it shows not protecting because the other VM is starting. My little lab environment isn't really spec'd out for this, so it's just going to take a little bit longer for it to catch up. And we can see the secondary VM location there, so I will click on that, and that's taken us to the host where we can see it's there and it's got an alert on it because it's still trying to catch up. So I'll give that a few minutes to catch up, and then we'll take a look at testing this configuration. And now this virtual machine shows as protected. So let's have a look at what we can do with it now. We go back into our fault tolerance menu. Obviously, we can turn off fault tolerance. We can suspend fault tolerance. This is handy for diagnostic purposes if we think there is a performance issue which could be related to the use of fault tolerance. We can suspend fault tolerance, and then when we resume, it just has to bring the secondary virtual machine back in sync with the primary, as opposed to turning off fault tolerance, which would require the secondary virtual machine to be recreated from scratch. We can migrate the secondary VM to another host if we wish. We can't do that in this environment because we've only got two hosts. One's running the primary, one is running the secondary. Obviously, there would be no point in running the secondary on the same host as the primary, so we won't be able to do that. But that's how you could move the secondary VM if, for example, you needed to perform maintenance on the host to which it is connected. Test failover will perform a controlled failover to the secondary VM. That will make the secondary VM the primary, and what is now the primary becomes the secondary. So we can see I've just done that. Now the secondary VM is on host 1. It's the same VM. We haven't moved the VMs. It's just changed which is the primary and which is the secondary. And now it's showing as not protected. So again, it's going to need a few minutes to straighten that out. And finally, the other thing we can do with fault tolerance is we can test restart the secondary. So we can restart the secondary VM without actually failing over to it.